Good morning. I would like to warmly welcome you to this first thematic conference of the International Association for the Study of the Commons. This is the first time that an event like this takes place. It was part of the will expressed by the executive board of the International Association for the Study of the Commons to launch a series of thematic conferences. And I would like to say from the very beginning that the idea is not to do a one-shot event, even if this will be a great meeting and there are many outstanding speakers. So I think the event on itself is already worthwhile and very exciting. But we really want to build a long-term and sustained effort for bringing you people together, basically, together with young researchers, PhD students, postdocs, to build a community that can recognize itself in this common work. And so we would like every 2 years or 3 years, Tino will say a word on that, to have a call for papers on the knowledge commons and to gradually build a community who knows that that's the place where the latest research on this topic is presented, where people can meet on a consistent basis, but in an academic context. And I would like to say a word on that as well, that it is a tradition within the International Association to do also some transdisciplinary research, not just interdisciplinary, which means that the importance of connecting with the stakeholders and the different senior policy people who are active in the field. So we're happy to have amongst our keynotes as well very high-level officials like Mr. Bakhmachari from India, Emile Frison, and many others, which I'm not citing now. So I think this is an important thing that we want to pursue in the future as well. A little final word on the content of the conference. Of course, the word commons is in the conference. So some people might be afraid by it, by saying, okay, I'm not usual to this field. Other people might say, I'm very safe now. I'm with the scholars of the commons, so everything's solved. We know where we are. I think none of these is true. I think the basic message is that the work is still to be done on the knowledge commons, even if we can build upon the work of Lynn Ostrom, which will be in the key focus of this conference. And at the reception, we will have some more tribute to her life as well, with a video tribute which has been prepared by the International Association. Within the field of the commons, why do we focus on the knowledge commons in this conference? It comes from the conference in Hyderabad in India, where there was a lot of talk about the new commons. And we realized that there is a kind of a galaxy of people working on the commons now. And one of the important points stressed by Lynn Ostrom is the importance of building specific typologies where you can build your models. So she has built this concept of common pool resources, which was a specific concept adapted for comparative case study research within a very broad set, but it were not all the commons. So in the same way, the task has to be done for us to see within the knowledge commons how can we organize large-scale comparative case study research with multiple methods, but which is sufficiently specific to one typology of problems, which here are the knowledge commons. Within the knowledge commons, we have 3 broad streams in this conference, which are the cultural commons, the genetic resource commons, and the digital resource commons. And this stream is also applied specifically to scientific research. What is in common to these research topics are the focus on information. So if we work on genetic resource commons, the idea is that the genetic resources are not accessed as commodities or as physical resources. Of course, there are physical resources as well, but they are accessed for their informational content. So yesterday I talked with some participants on stem cell research, and we were discussing what was the fit of this research within this conference. But very clearly, the gene banks which hold the stem cells for the broader scientific community, when people access them, they access them for their informational content and not to sell them as a commodity. And this is a common thread throughout the commons, is that how can we govern the knowledge commons as non-private goods. So what we focus on in the three streams is that in those three realities, digital commons, general resource commons, and cultural commons, there's a whole economics of production of public goods, which is decentralized, but which in the same time focused on non-private goods. And the governance means of those non-private goods is still an open question. We have a lot of evidence of failures of market-based governance, of at least of a unilateral copy of market-based governance to these goods. But what the alternative is, I would say, is an open question. And of course, the experts are here. There are many answers. And I think the task of the community will be to consolidate this knowledge on the governance of those non-private goods in the knowledge commons. So I would like to give the word on Tina, who will say something who is a co-chair of this event, and who will say something as well about the link with some upcoming events and also the relationship with the IASC. And then I will give the word to Florin, who is our session chair, who will introduce the speakers of this morning's session. So please, Tina.
Thank you, Tom. As a co-chair, I think I first of all want to thank the organization here for basically not giving me a lot of work. They've done really everything. So, there is a reason for that. We see this as a sort of joint venture between Louvain-la-Neuve University and Utrecht University. I'll say a bit more about that in a moment. But first of all, I would like to thank you on behalf of the IASC, the International Association for the Study of the Commons. Quite a few members are here, quite a few board members are here. Our president-elect Leticia Marino is here, and she will be saying a bit more tonight, together with Meg McKean, about the history of the IASC, the relationship also with Eleanor Ostrom, and where we are going with the IASC, and how much we also hope as the IASC that you will be part of that, because we think that knowledge commons are a vital component of the whole commons debate, and we need the experts to take part in that. So we are very keen as the IASC to develop this part of the commons debate further within our organization on a worldwide scale. We are a world organization with people from both academia and the field, so to speak, and from all over the world. So we'd like to expand in that direction in the future as well. Second, but Leticia will say a bit more tonight about that. Secondly, I would like to welcome you on behalf of the Utrecht University. It's a few kilometers, 100 kilometers from here, but there's close mental and intellectual balance, I may say, between two departments. Over here, the BioGov unit run by Tom, and our department has several projects on institutions for collective action at large, so self-governed and organizations that are formed bottom-up. We have a number of projects on commons and related forms of institutions within the history department. So we look at the long-term development in Utrecht, and specifically at the design and the dynamics of such institutions. And of course, types as knowledge commons would also fit in, well, in many cases at least, in institutions for collective action. We are planning in the long term, and that would be, I think, within a year or two, depending on the success of this meeting, of course, but I'm sure that will be all right. We're planning to have a sort of follow-up of this conference. We're building it into a sequel. But of course, you will be hearing more about that later on. But the first upcoming event is already in a few months' time, at the end of November. We have a conference on the design and dynamics of institutions for collective action. It was originally going to be opened by Eleanor Ostrom, who will not be there, of course, but because of her presence, we were already thinking of honoring her there, and now we will start a conference with a tribute to her, whereby we reflect on her role in academia in several domains, amongst others, knowledge commons. That will happen on the 29th of November, and then on the 30th of November and the 1st of December, we will have a fairly big conference, about the same size here, about 80 people should be there, about 65 papers, on various topics of institutions for collective action, in particular their long-term development. There are some flyers over here and at the table which give you some more information. If you want to join as a listener, the program will be ready by next week, and you can see that at the website. I think I've said enough, and we will hear more about the IASC and other things tonight, and I'll give the mic to Florin.
Thank you. My name is Florin Popa. I'm a postdoctoral researcher here in the BioGov unit of Center for the Philosophy of Law. First of all, I would like to thank everybody for being here. I know most of you have been traveling a lot yesterday. I hope you're well rested for the work ahead. For those of you who are not well rested, there's a coffee break in 1 hour and a half. I'd just like to briefly introduce the keynote speakers for this morning. First of all, the keynote presentations are a maximum of 30 minutes, and then we'll have 15 minutes of discussion, questions and answers. So our first keynote speaker is Professor Paul David. Professor David is Professor of Economics at Stanford University, US, and Professorial Fellow at the United Nations University, a Maastricht Economic and Research Institute of Innovation and Technology in the Netherlands. His research interests include the economics of technological, demographic, and institutional change, economic history, with special reference to long-term productivity growth and development in the US and North Atlantic economies in the modern history, with current research focusing on such contemporary public policy issues such as the role of interoperability standards in the evolution of network industries and the changing interrelationships between open science and proprietary research and development activities. Professor David, it's a great honor to have you here. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I'd like to start by saying that it's a pleasure and it's an honor to have been invited to open this conference. It's quite an important step that the association has taken in launching a program of thematic conferences. And I think it's doubly important that the theme chosen for this first such conference ties together the questions of the development of the commons and the role commons, those who study the commons, design governance, the knowledge commons may play in dealing with complexity and almost overwhelming difficulties. I will try, as the title of this talk says, to hold these two rather large, complicated topics together, and to at least introduce my way of approaching both of them and thinking about how they interconnect, and particularly the ways in which the development of the knowledge commons, in all of its varied forms, can make a contribution to what will be a sustained, global, and hopefully successful effort to respond to the challenge of global warming. It's not all going to be text at this density, but it may be easier for people to read some of the technical material. The thing I want to start with is the premise for much of what follows, which is my view that climate stabilization and sustainable development will require a coordinated, global, enduring effort stretching, if we're lucky, over the next 60 or 70 years, and if successful, will achieve stabilization of the climate by halting the increasing concentration of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. object of this, I think as most people understand, is to halt the increase in radiative forcing from the filtering, the differential filtering of the radiation from the sun, which is warming the Earth's surface and producing, and will produce a set of potentially very, very dangerous consequences, including the destabilization of the climate concept, which I'll say a little bit further about. In what I have to say, I'm going to essentially put aside the many frustrating, difficult problems of achieving timely national and international political commitments to take substantial action and action with growing momentum in this effort. I will try to indicate the scope of the technological and material resource allocation efforts that will have to be made in order to achieve the goal of sufficiently reducing CO2 and other greenhouse gas emissions that are of anthropogenic origin, arising from human activities, and to do that sufficiently quickly so that the warming of the Earth's surface, which is already in the pipeline, will not continue to the point where it itself begins to produce self-reinforcing effects, which will hold the threat of irreversible runaway warming process, which lie beyond the power of humanity to halt, because what is in danger is the Earth's ability to continue to sequester CO2 in natural forms, in the forests, in the oceans. And once the process begins to release those greenhouse gases, then the question is that even if you stopped all anthropogenic emissions of CO2, you would still have warming, and it would continue. The challenge is not obviously simply a technological challenge, because technology has to be developed. There has to be organization to advance the technological frontier. It has to be deployed. And the job, if you think of it as a task, of coordinating the efforts to develop a suite, a portfolio of technological solutions for different aspects of this problem, and actually organize the knowledge that will be needed to suit those technologies to a multiplicity of different environments, different ecological, economic, and social organization is pretty staggering if you begin to think about it. I think about this as a challenge which will exceed anything in terms of social organization that humanity has ever attempted. When I get depressed, I try to think about the whole thing. When I try to be, as I habitually am, more optimistic, I think of this not as one thing, but as a sequence of campaigns. Take the analogy from warfare, perhaps, in the sense of mobilization. And generals do not fight wars. They fight campaigns. They structure a sequence of campaigns so that each one establishes a position, logistically, vocationally, and in terms of force levels, that will enable them to launch the next campaign. And if we think then of a transition from where we are now to a carbon-based global production regime to a low carbon, sufficiently low carbon production regime so that natural abatement capacity of the Earth can deal with such emissions as will be continuing without destabilizing the planet, then we're thinking of a long transition process, which is going to absorb many decades. And this is a process which will be fraught by many interruptions and intervening events which will distract humanity from this task, as it has been distracted recently by world crisis and other events. And so it's a really novel task to think about organizing a set of consciousness of peoples of the world, that they cannot lose the thread of what has to be done, cannot put it aside, cannot forget that every pause in action will only make the next task harder. So, all right. So it's serious. However, it has lots of dimensions which people in the social sciences, as well as in the natural and technical sciences, know about. And when you begin to think about it, it's actually quite exciting, because it's a way of inventorying almost everything that we've come to understand about the workings of society, resource application, its political structure, its social organization, the way its ideologies have transformed, the way people are motivated. There's very, very little that academic researchers have done dealing with social processes which will not be in one way or another entangled and relevant to what has to be done. So if we can do this, we not only save the planet, but at some point, some future generations will be able to look back and say, oh, these people actually got organized and used their knowledge. Okay. So the question is, can the knowledge commons role be in this process? So first, I want to call your attention to the set of papers which explicitly address one or another facet of this problem, which are on the program. 6 papers which you see there are very varied. I've learned a lot from them, and at some points will avert to points which they come up. And in addition to the papers which are on the program on the 13th in the morning sessions, we are also looking forward to a keynote address from Clyde at Berkeley, Professor Brennan Hall, which you can see at the bottom of this. So this is just, if you like, a yellow line, a highlight for you to look at the program and trace the track. This is track 6 plus this, and there is a finale on the last day in which the discussion session to which Tom has referred will try to come back with local now located experts from other organizations and agencies dealing with some of these issues. We'll talk with you about what things seem priorities, what things seem worth studying and understanding more deeply, what kinds of initiatives might be made in organization and the design of suitable. I think it's important to understand the connection between the problem of organizing technological solutions and the nature of the climate change problem, which economists come to recognize as a problem involving 2 externalities. An externality is simply a process in which the effects of the actions of individual actors and groups of actors are not internalized for them. The costs do not fall upon them. The benefits do not accrue only to them. This has an implication for analysis of resource allocation because it means that if resource allocation is dependent upon the workings of private markets in which individuals make decisions which are reflected in the market prices, then the existence of the externalities means that the effects are not likely to be registered and not likely to shape decisions. So the first externality is the greenhouse gas emissions externality. The effects of burning hydrocarbons do not just fall upon the person who decides to light the fire and put the log, the coal, fire up the oil heater, any of these sources which will yield emissions of CO2. It doesn't fall on the people who take apart their refrigerator and release the hydrofluorocarbons, which may be in the old-fashioned cooling system, and it doesn't affect the farmers whose ruminants release a lot of methane as a byproduct from digesting the grasses that they eat. Nor the rice farmers in Asia, whose rice paddies also are releasing methane because of the organic materials which are under the water and which are being broken down by anaerobic organisms. So these gases go everywhere, okay, to the atmosphere, eventually through the carbon cycle, to all complicated process, and then they affect everyone. I think people understand this problem, but its implication is that that it is not possible for people to continue to look at this problem and believe in the magic of the market, to believe that it's not necessary for action, for resource allocation action, which is purposive to correct what is the inefficient allocation of resources, which fails to take account of the social cost of greenhouse gas emissions. Now this leads to sort of two lines of response from economists and from policymakers. One of them is to try to fix this by altering the price of carbon, by pricing carbon. Okay? So and for the last 20 years, a lot of policy has been oriented in that direction because it appears to be such a simple solution. If we could only get the price of the carbon right, then markets would work and we wouldn't have to have interventions, and so markets would work perfectly. But there's reason to believe that markets don't work perfectly for other reasons, and one of them happens to deal with what I'll call the second externality, which is that information is a strange commodity, not like other commodities. It has different economic properties, and those properties are handled very badly by competitive market processes as well. So that if you think that the solution is to mobilize the information that we have about how to stop greenhouse gas emissions, whether it's technological, organizational, or other kinds of information, including information about what is a better way for one personally to look after one's health, or one's family's health, or reorganize one's transportation and lifestyle. The production of this information and its distribution is not going to be socially efficient if it is left to the workings of pure competitive market processes. And so on both sides, there is a need for other kinds of directed action to fix this process. This means that one needs to begin thinking about the various ways in which the signals for individual actors can go wrong, and how these can be corrected. And it's at that point that the use of Nonheart mechanisms, including the commons, begins to be of immediate relevance. And in the course of what I have to say, if I now pick up speed and go much faster through the set of slides, I will try to notice the familiar ways in which the commons as a instrumentality, as a mechanism for solving resource allocation problems, to improve social welfare, can be engaged at various points in the larger effort to respond to the challenge of global warming. And then I will also try to look at the institutional and organizational changes that need to be made to supplement the workings of existing institutions, and to see how the commons can work in an institutional context with other forms of organization, which I think is a very important point for people to explore and to understand, and to not think of the commons as a freestanding human organization. It is a particular affordance of contrivance which has certain properties in certain institutional, legal, and other contexts. It derives its power from some of them. It derives its purpose from the weaknesses of others. And so in this contextualized sense, one begins to get an idea of where different forms of conflict can have some operational bite to improve our common situation. Very briefly, where are we with climate change now? Well, we have graduated beyond warming. We don't talk about warming. Warming was too cozy. It seemed like this would be, well, what's a little gradual warming? You can think about that. Change in some parts of the climate science communities, change is too neutral. What people are talking about now, and which I'm convinced is a direct way to talk about it, is climate destabilization. That stabilization is what we want technically in terms of greenhouse gas concentrations. And to understand it, as I've said, this derives from the dual situation of the fact that as people have sunk ice cores 2 miles deep and recovered a quantitative record of the world's climate, it is seen that there are long swings in which there have been marked variations in greenhouse gas concentrations and corresponding variations in temperature. There is this slow trend rise, about which there's been a lot of debate, but most of it is settled. There is a rising trend, not just fluctuations around the trend. That the nature of the underlying process is one in which the very, very long life of CO2 means that past emissions which eventually reach the atmosphere are going to persist there for a very long time. So warming and increases of warming as a consequence of things which happened already are in the pipeline. And even if we stop now, we would have continuing warming. And this is connected with thermal, through the thermal expansion of the oceans. The transformation of the oceans has implications for acidification, for changing in fish, in species survival, and in fish stocks, on which lots of the world's population are dependent. And this is just one manifestation of the problems of coming to understand the extent to which what firms, what households, what communities depend upon what now called ecosystem services, which have been largely unvalued, and whose degradation and disappearance has, on recent calculations, in the last 50 years, been very, very substantial. And these are losses which if continued, will jeopardize the viability of many communities. These graphs, which show what is happening in terms of greenhouse gas concentration levels, are already, although they are 2009, are already badly out of date. The recent acceleration in emissions is very great, and the mechanism here is suggested just in a very simple way as a feedback loop, and what can be a set of cascades in which the warming begets changes which increase the warming rate. And this is the problem, not only the irreversible warming which is in the pipeline, but irreversible acceleration, continued warming through the feedback, runaway global warming. That suggests that there is something possibly out there which is a tipping point, an edge of a manifold where once you cross it, you won't necessarily know that you've crossed it, but you are now in a different region. And so this is a difficult problem for human societies to deal with. Think back to the Millennium Bug. There we understood, if you remember, that there would be a date on which, if people didn't do something to their computers, the date stamp would not work properly, and there would be malfunction, particularly in older mainframe machines. Everybody knew where the edge of the manifold was, but for reasons which one can analyze, everybody wanted to be the last person on the street to fix their computer, okay? In part because they are dependent upon the functioning of the larger system, and if other people didn't fix the date stamps, then they would have the burden of having the forward date year, and they would have to convert back to 2 in order to send things to other people, and so forth. And they would have to convert the incoming 2 in order to process that. So this interdependence made everybody want to wait until somebody else would do it. So this is a kind of prisoner's dilemma for people acting independently. If they knew what the other people would do and committed, but otherwise they played defensively. And their strategy was that everybody waited, and there was very little progress done in solution. The solution was not a catastrophe, but it was much more expensive than it needed to be. And that was easy. Now try it with you don't know where the manifold is. And this is what people are worried about. The last time the Earth warmed, which was at the end of the previous glacial era, coming into the happy stadial period with which we have been living for about 14,000 years, 15,000 years, the Holocene period, was not an easy, gentle warming transition. It was a long, extended period of chaos. This is measured in thousands of years, and this is the fluctuation in the temperature, and it's also a fluctuation correlated with measures of greenhouse gas in the atmosphere. And one can see not only the tight correlation, but you can also see the enormous volatility of short-term temperature movements. So between the coldest part of the ice age and the warmest part of the stadial is about 12 degrees Celsius difference in temperature. This climate flickering, which is what the scientists begin to call it, involves about half of that move, 6 degrees, within periods of less than 5 years. Okay? So the notion of that if we enter this kind of chaotic movement, and there have been some nice books written about the reign of chaos that would be as we moved before we moved into the Holocene, you cannot adapt to that. Try farming when your whole microclimate is shifting. And this is not correlated all over the Earth. The Earth has many climates, and the evidence from the ice cores is that there is a lot from different places. These things are not in phase, so predictability is, forget it. So the moral of this is we just don't want to go there. Okay? And so without knowing exactly where the bear starts, it changes the whole structure of how important it is to take maximum effort at the beginning, to not worry about the possibility that if we make a great effort, then we will find out that the whole thing somehow was wrong, and we will have spent a lot of resources and made a lot of investments which weren't necessary. The risk of that is too great. You're buying insurance for the future of the Earth. So that's a reality check on what the climate sciences is telling us. Get moving. There's a quick check on the economic and political realities, which is most of the calculations suggest we have only a brief window of time for precautionary actions. That we see the effect in the last 3-4 years, where some very, very good plans, such as the EU strategic plan, have been pretty much derailed, where things reached went to a stop in the United States before we never got on board with Kyoto. The Copenhagen meetings failed to produce commitments and reconcile the different positions between the newly industrializing countries, BRICS, and the older developed countries about the distribution of impacts of the burden of making commitments to really cut back on, particularly on the use of coal-fired power plants, and this set of problems has rather discouraged people, waiting for some change to happen which will unlock the gridlock politically. It's become clear, at least to some people, that one part of the source of this is the reluctance of most nations, and particularly the recently developing nations, to commit to a slowdown or a very costly set of investments in order to meet commitments to reduce emissions, which will be very expensive unless there is very substantial technological advance, which makes the cost of replacing existing carbon-based energy sources and industrial processes with non-carbon, with renewables. So what that implies is that there is a kind of intertemporal complementarity of which of these things should you start first. Economists initially started arguing, well, if we could just get agreement on raising carbon prices, then that would signal people that they're going to need to invest in ways to reduce their consumption of carbon, and then everything would go smoothly as people follow market signals. But if people don't believe that is going to be forthcoming, and there are reasons to doubt it, because it's not clear that you will get this kind of actually a workable system globally that will raise not only the present prices, but the future prices of carbon, just give the right signals. Then we have this problem that the technology will not necessarily be forthcoming, and the costs of this are going to be very high. So one way of looking at it is maybe technology and commitment to technology to create a realistic, credible prospect that there will be technological advances is where we need to start now. And at a later point, we can revisit the other program to supplement that. So we need to walk on both legs to get across this great space. But it may be the fact that one cannot be indifferent about which leg you start out to walk. Okay, so timing matters. Okay, the rest is going to go even faster. Okay, so I'm not going to spend time articulating the array of technological options, but simply to suggest that there are two major classes of near-term options. One, all of the things that can be done to reduce emissions, technologically, to reduce emissions output ratio from carbon using processes. That's agriculture, everything. The second is whatever can be done technologically to reduce the capital cost of replacing carbon burning with carbon-free technologies. And with the suite of so-called renewables, and one has to include safe nuclear power within that category. Those are two different directions. One of them, the first of them, really involves the mobilization of a lot of things we already know how to do. How to improve insulation of buildings, how to make transport vehicles more energy efficient, how to restructure the location of urban communities. There are a lot of gains from denser habitation. There are other offsetting risks, but inventories have been made of the potential for savings, which are very, very large. This doesn't involve breakthrough technology. It involves the mobilization of existing knowledge. It involves informing and working out in ways in which this can be implemented by many people at the level of people who properly install solar panels on people's housing, or reconfigure the way elevators and high-rise buildings work, so that they use much less electricity to get them up to the top. This has all been done. So this is something which is rather different from the idea of having to do fundamental research to get breakthroughs in reducing the cost of renewable technology and improve manufacturing processes to make that less costly. So we have two different streams of work, and that suggests that two different clienteles. That the investment in epistemic advances in technologies that we don't have now and want to replace is rather different from the other tasks. And that suggests that the experience of the commons which emerged from epistemic research communities, scientific communities, is relevant to one part of the task to a greater extent, but being able to connect up the best practices in the implementation of known engineering techniques which have to be implemented on a wide and distributed scale in different environments and adapted to different circumstances is another kind of task of information gathering and if you like, curation and annotation and distribution. Both of those call for different kinds of commons organizations. I've mentioned the problem of information's peculiar properties, which economists think of as constituting public goods properties, that there are cause it not to be priced, and to pose the problem that if you compare the price information that you have that's already available, you can't recover the fixed cost, the first copy cost. You can't, the benefits are not valued by people's willingness to pay because free riding is possible. So you need an array of solutions to deal with these problems. And traditionally, in other areas where you have the similar characteristics of very, very high fixed cost and very, very low marginal costs, in this case, reduction costs, there are three ways in which this has been dealt with for a long time and it's been understood. Tax finance, subsidies for the activity, to cover the fixed cost, granting monopolies so that people can mark up their prices above the competitive very low marginal costs which would arise if you just left it to a competitive market, or you use tax finance state provision. These have their corresponding institutional solutions in the case of information goods. State patronage, which is tax finance, it's open science reward system, and open science, because it doesn't take a proprietary return on the knowledge, but essentially grants it back to the users, is not freestanding. It will not support itself. It must be externally supported. Okay? This is one of the reasons why, if it can be coupled with the private system, for which it provides useful knowledge, then it's possible for the state to properly fund it. The property solution, we have monopoly rights as the solution to provide incentives for the fixed investment. And then there is state government procurement. And of course, what's happened in the last 30 years has been that the balance in which some of each of these methods was found in most of the developed countries has been disturbed by changes in attitudes, by fiscal problems of government, by a preference for getting the state out of direct production of services, so that there's been a shift in the direction of the property solution, and this problem, as well known to people who have been studying the knowledge commons, because it has led to the conflicts between the intellectual property regime and the aspiration to have open, easy access, to have existing knowledge available at the very minimum cost that it costs to reproduce it, and to take account and to make best use of the fact that information can be reused, can be repurposed, does not get burned up in the process of its application. And so, in the sphere of copyright, where this has been encountered in the sort of open access sort of movement, we have well-known exemplars of successful bottom-up efforts. Open access publishing, licensing of some rights reserved, but not all rights reserved. Creative Commons has developed, and forms of licensing such as copyleft, which leave the products of people's contributions to software available for them to build on, and to build on what other people have added in this process. So this is a form, particularly the latter, and the Creative Commons, are forms of contracting, to use contracting to repurpose the property rights which the system has given us by statute for goals other than private wealth accumulation. So there are two ways in which this strategy has come into play. One I call the sort of classic commons, or the commons, in which there is you start with a situation in which there are expected gains in knowledge which are not presently subject to intellectual property claims, and there is a decision made not to take intellectual property on it, but to leave it in the public domain, and to do so in a way that sufficiently makes it clear that it becomes prior art, an open prior art, and cannot be subjected to copyright or to patent. So this is what I would call the ex-ante commons construction. And there are examples of that, which I might be able to show, but I don't think I'm going to get there. The other is this creature called the quasi-commons. The quasi-commons, sometimes in American uses called the semi-commons, is really an ex post repair. It says there is already copyright, or there are patents on certain techniques. And these are causing obstruction of sharing. Patents on key items form a thicket. This interferes with downstream research, so it inhibits, can inhibit innovation. It also makes the whole transaction process, in order to get all the necessary tools, which may be owned by different parties, together in a bundle. It can be, that can be a very expensive bundle, a needlessly expensive bundle, if all of the holders don't actually internalize and take account of what the other parts of the complementary tool set are going to be priced at. So one of the things you can do is to try to pool them. And there is an incentive for the users who hold parts of the tool set that they all need to come together and agree to openly license them to one another within the pool. And that people who put anything into the pool get to use the other ones on a shared common use licenses. So this is referred to, I mean, the term really started with a paper by of contractual construction, the comments of my colleagues, Paul Lear, and Jerry, as the authors of a contractual construction terminology. Okay, so this is pushback. There is the trying to shrink the operative part of the domain. There are some examples where there have been, in this case, an ex-ante organization, people who agreed before starting off on a series of projects that it would be all open and shared. And there have been the other ex post ideas for creating contractually constructed commons. An example of that is the Creative Commons NeuroCommons project, which started as an effort among a considerable group of researchers who were all in a patent thicket with each other, saying, why don't we just license it freely to everybody else and stop the negotiations over the intellectual property rights on what we might produce if we could ever get the whole tool set together. We have a case of another kind of contractually constructed comments in the case of the echo patent comments. And I'm not going to say a lot about this because I hope that we will hear from Bronwyn Hall, who has been right here doing research in this and other related areas. This has its initiative with IBM, actually, in the World Council for Sustainable Development some years back, and it involved people just donating, or not donating in a strict sense, because they don't get any credit for a donation. They just said, we don't want intellectual property to operate on these patents, and we will put them in there. The question really then is whether that these patents are really important, whether they are forming a commons of the kind that is efficient because you have a set of complementary tools, and if you make them available, then you don't have blocking of other, the use of other tools which work with them, or whether these are patents which are no longer of central value to the firms that are donating them. And I think the latter, in this case, is what was found earlier. So let me just now quickly mention a couple of other ideas. To get around the obstacles which the intellectual property system creates, not only in blocking the use of patented material for downstream, but also because by granting a monopoly in the use of it, you creates a barrier to more widespread use. The monopolist puts up the price. The higher price forecloses the use of whatever it is that the monopolist is pricing by some part of the population. Economists talk about this, the deadweight loss. So that by having a monopolist deliver it, you deliver it to fewer people. And when you have something which has spillovers for other people, like if you have a monopoly on a standard for an industrial process, then if you limit the number of people who are using the standard, that injures the other people who would work with that, with the company that used the same standard. So it's a double inefficiency. Prizes, they say, would be an alternative reward mechanism. If we have competitive prizes, you reward the best submission, and that's the patent system is a kind of it's a lottery for a prize. If you patent it first, and your patent dominates the field, then you will be able to extract a rent. If nothing comes along and makes your invention obsolete soon, or if there are not other challenges. So recently, there's been a great growth of interest in patents in industry and charitable foundations, and the US government in 2010 rolled out a program in which all the agencies of government were encouraged to offer prizes as a way of directing. So my simple point about this is that the way they have done this has replicated all the perverse features of the patent system, because all the people who submitted get to keep the intellectual property. The winner gets the prize. All of the other submissions are not available for anybody to use. They're not collected. They don't become available even for viewing. And so there's a possibility of creating a commons for the submissions for those prizes, and structuring rewards and sharing revenue. And this is something which the thin end of the wedge may be for charitable foundations to do this, but governments, and the US government is not alone in this. The British government has done the same thing with energy prices. So that's one kind of method. This is the first point. And there are other methods. Some of them have to do with bottom-up initiatives to connect sources of information in the developing world, where a lot of ecological preservation and structuring for ways to prevent degrading of those ecosystem resources need to be connected to centers which are doing research on this, both to provide data and monitoring what's happening in the world, and also to get guidance and to represent local community interests. This is not being done in general. What you see is that there are large corporations that have plans for this, and these are very top-down. And they plan for all over the world, and they don't tell you about their local operations. Still, another, and my last one, is that we have interferences in mobility. And mobility through contracts, which are forced upon employees, which say they cannot compete in the same industry, but there's no reason. Often the state actually damages employees, and you could form commons, essentially clubs, among employers in the same reason, which would make possible the circulation of skilled workers. Okay, so, and there is also the question of knowledge for this answer. So I leave you with the summary message at the end of the slides. If you relieved, you can read it in the next couple of minutes. But the point is, I didn't want to discourage you or dismay you. I want to encourage you to be an active part of the necessary response that starts with knowledge about the variety of economies, about how they can be governed, how government mechanisms can be adapted to special purposes, to work with other organizations to find complementary uses of this institution, and to expand its reach and its power, and take apart is something that humanity is going to struggle with for the next many decades.
Thank you, Professor David, for this very interesting presentation. The floor is open to everybody. For questions or comments. Yes, but we'll take a few minutes. We can go to the next speaker. Is there? Yes. Okay, we'll see how much time we have at the end of it.
Yeah, that's fine. Okay. I'll try to stay here if you agree. Thank you.
Okay, then I'd like to briefly introduce next keynote speaker, Professor Mansell. She's Professor of New Media and the Internet at the Department of Media and Communication in London School of Economics and Social Science and Political Science in London. And her research focuses on communication, especially in a medium of information and communication technologies. Has a special interest in the relationships between institutional and micro-level change and in technological innovation, inequality, and social justice. With current research focusing on the social, political, and economic influences of media and communication policy and regulation, with a special interest in governance arrangements for the new media and the Internet. Professor Mansell, it's an honor to have you here. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Florian. Thank you for the invitation. Good morning to everyone. They say quite often that Canadians, which I am, speak very, very quickly, and I'm going to try not to live up to that expectation, but at the same time, I will try to catch up with some time following Paul's very interesting presentation. I'm going to switch from talking about climate change and issues of that kind to addressing some issues around how we manage in the commons, within the commons, when the question is the production, circulation, appropriation, and use of digital information. What I'm going to do is present you with a framework, which is, I think, helpful in thinking about issues of governance within the commons, the digital information commons, and I'm going to relate that to what some of those differences in governing in the commons mean for how we think about informational activities and the uses to which digital information is put. I'm going to talk broadly about two different groups who participate in the digital commons. One I'll talk about as formal science professionals, and the other one I will refer to as loosely organized online groups, with the emphasis on groups. Groups obviously encompass communities, but groups, as we'll see, can be much more loosely organized in some cases and play an important role in generating digital information that can be socially and economically useful, just as can science professionals. Just to start off with a kind of a stark opposition, one that is probably too stark, but helps to make a point. Some groups, particularly those in the formal science communities, at the extreme would say that useful knowledge depends on scientifically validated and curated digital information, regardless of how information is sourced in the big data crowdsourcing digital information online era. On the other hand, we have loosely organized online groups who might maintain that useful knowledge depends on the voluntary contributions of distributed online groups using commons-based peer production models for validating digital information. Two starkly oppositional ends of what we might see as a continuum. We could talk about technological developments in IT, but I want to talk about organizational developments to do with organizing within the digital commons. And I'm going to use the term social technology. Social technology is a way of referring to the arrangements, practices, and norms that enable the organization of society, in our case, the digital commons. This term has a venerable history. It was used by Henderson many, many years ago to talk about the system of conscious and purposeful organization of persons. Long before there was a virtual world, I'm going to be talking about those kinds of conscious and purposeful ways of doing things with information in the virtual world. As many of you who are familiar with the writings of Dick Nelson will know, he also used the term social technology to talk about the institutional modes of coordination and facilitating markets and collective action. In other words, social technologies are not something that just applies to the commons, it also applies to markets. So the question that I want to ask today, to focus our minds on, is what social technology or technologies is optimal or most appropriate for managing in the digital information commons? And of course, you might also ask in the enclosed online commons, which Paul was making more reference to. I'm going to deal mainly with the first, the digital information commons. So, first of all, and Paul also made this point, there are many kinds of commons. It's a very crucial point. It's one that Elinor Ostrom has been making throughout the 80s and 90s. And to quote Catherine Hess, Charlotte Hess, I'm sorry, who's here, outcomes of the interactions of people and resources can be positive or negative or somewhere in between in the commons. I think it's very important to remember that. They've argued that strong collective action is often needed in order to avert the risks and problems that arise within the commons and to ensure that commons-based activities are sustainable. As they argue, a self-organized commons requires strong collective action and self-governing mechanisms, as well as a high degree of social capital on the part of stakeholders. What I want to ask today, though, is what happens when those strong forms of collective action come into contact, as they increasingly do, in the digital commons, with much more dispersed and loosely organized forms of governance, which you could barely call strong forms of governance. Some might want to call them chaotic, some might want to call them radical, whatever you want to call them. My question today is going to be, what happens when they come into contact with each other? What barriers are there for the management of digital information which might become useful knowledge? Is there an in-between mode of organizing within the commons which is coming into play when these disparate, loosely organized groups come into contact with formal science communities? And this is a question I think that can apply in almost any domain you care to think about, whether it happens to be global warming or whether it happens to be emergency situations or whether it happens to be some other area of scientific activity. So, if we think about social technologies, norms and arrangements for organizing within the commons, we might say that there's a continuum of what I want to call, in the first case, constituted authority, strong collective action, where there's a single authority who is exercising some kind of top-down control which is exercised based upon a collective interest in the accuracy of digital information, in accountability for the generation of digital information, something which is very reminiscent of the conventional norms of science. And what is the outcome of those kinds of activities? The outcome in the online environments is the accumulation of curated stocks of information which can be used and reused and recombined in the interests of the advancement of useful knowledge. On the other hand, at the other end of a continuum, we might think, and this is what is often less talked about, is dispersed collective action or adaptive authority. In the case of adaptive authority, we have multiple authorities in peer relationships with no single controller. The consistency and accuracy of information is subject to negotiation and voluntary compliance. This, of course, is reminiscent of the open source software movement. It's reminiscent of what Benkler has called commons-based peer production. But as we will see, it's also reminiscent of a lot of other much more loosely connected communities. The outcome in these cases, and bear in mind I'm painting a picture of a continuum, is quite often ephemeral information flows. And these ephemeral information flows are quite often used as inputs to social action, as if they had been validated by the norms of peer peer refereed science. But because of the temporality and the time criticality of the need for social action, quite often the information that is generated in these settings online is not validated by the norms and conventions of science, but it still matters. So we have two forms of authority, constituted and adaptive. Formal science groups tend to be attached to constituted modes of authority. As I said, they value curated stocks of digital information resources. Open science might be seen to be somewhat different, but even open science, as the Royal Society in the UK has just said, is not an unqualified good. Access to digital information, even in open science, is for qualified others, those who have met the requirements of how one assesses and validates digital information. And in this sense, you could imagine that even open science retains a privileged role for itself, for formal science, even in the big data era. At the other end of the spectrum, you have what I've called loosely organized groups, more affiliated with what I've called adaptive authority. They value, in general, ephemeral flows of digital information. In a way, you could see these groups as being aligned with the overflowings of information generated by concerned groups, as Callan would probably say. The information generated by these groups is often extremely hard to accommodate within the governance models of formal science. Yet, some of these groups apply practices which are becoming familiar to us. They borrow from the norms and arrangements which have been developed in this open source software communities. But again, they're even more dispersed than those communities. What they are is really part of the participatory online culture that a lot of sociologists of the media and online virtual communities are talking about, what Henry Jenkins would refer to as participatory culture, or what Clay Shirky would regard as the radicals, as opposed to the conventionalists. Often we see studies in which a lot of attention is paid to the first group and how it is evolving in the big data era, or we see studies which pay a lot of attention to the second group, who follow adaptive authority norms. How often do we actually do comparative empirical case studies of when the two come together? And in the rest of this talk, I want to give a few illustrations of where they do arguably come together and what that means. Before I do that, I just want to draw attention to what I mean by this affiliation of formal science to digital curation and accumulating validated stocks of knowledge. When the formal science professionals speak about digital curation, what they normally mean is maintaining, preserving, and adding value to digital research data throughout its life cycle in trusted data repositories, which may be shared under the right circumstances and with those who are validated to engage in that sharing. Curation involves conceptualization, creating, assessing, and using, preserving, storing, assessing, and reusing and transforming digital information. Not losing it, but making sure it is preserved for reuse and for science. What is the goal? The goal is the long-term accumulation of useful knowledge. What are the values? The values are consistent with those of formal science. But there's another way in which the term curation is used. Content curation, rather than digital curation, tends to be the term which is used in the literature by those who are not talking about science. They're talking about entertainment data, they're talking about all manner of ephemeral, temporary data, music mashups, and the kinds of data that are generated by very loosely connected groups to address, quite often, emergency or disaster situations. What do these loosely connected online groups do? Well, some of them do use some of the formal science information practices. Some of them do. but they arguably aren't recognized as doing so by the formal science community. What else do? Well, they aggregate information, they distill information, they sift it, they select it, and they usually do it for use at a point in time. They put less emphasis onto information storage, preservation, and reuse for the development of future socially useful knowledge. Their goal is quite often to develop information which is useful now for immediate application. Their values are consistent with those of voluntary communities and what I'm calling even more loosely connected online groups. You may have been noticing the nice graphics on the side of the pictures. They haven't been about the virtual, have they? They've been about the bricks and mortar places. They're there to get you to see that there's some continuity here between what we think about in terms of organization and governance in the online digital world in terms of the norms and arrangements, and those which in many ways have been going on historically. And my message is that sometimes it helps to look backwards in order to figure out what it is that is going to enable these different communities to begin to work more productively together. And in the light of what I've said, excuse me, pointing out that there is a continuum, if you like, of social technologies of authority within the digital commons. I've referred to constituted, in short, top-down, and adaptive, in short, bottom-up, and the fact that these different groups may be interested in curated information, stocks, preserving it for reuse for the advancement of knowledge, or they may be more interested in ephemeral flows of information. And what we have been doing is research, empirically, comparing different instances of online activity, especially that activity which has come to be known as crowdsourcing, where you have enormously different, loosely connected communities, and looking to see at what different combinations there are and what possibilities there are within these communities or groups for developing information which is actually retained and becomes useful for future collaboration and advance and social problem solving. Before I come on to those examples, just wanted to highlight the fact that in this matrix, there are junctures where conflicts can occur between those who are much more comfortable with constituted authority as opposed to adaptive authority. Big conflicts come when you think about how they evaluate and decide what information should be retained and how it should be organized and accessed. This isn't just a filing cabinet problem. This is a problem of overcoming barriers to transforming the ephemeral information into curated information which is preserved for useful knowledge. What are some of the barriers? Well, I've already referred to some of them. Some of them are the immediacy of the need for social action. Some of them are resource-based. If you don't qualify as a formal science group, you may not be a candidate for resources. Quite often, you may not be invested in by the private sector because you are so disparate and so loosely organized, and you don't seem to have the same professional standards as historically have been recognized, that you just haven't got the funding to curate information. What's the problem with this? Why not just let the loosely organized communities get on with it? Well, there is a problem because the inability to retain or systematically assess what we might call know what, or we might call know why, prevents social welfare gains that might otherwise be possible. In other words, there's an overall loss to society by simply leaving these disparate groups to get on with it. There's a loss to formal science, and there's a loss to the loosely connected online groups. But both argue that their approach whether it's constituted authority or adaptive authority, is the optimal way to encourage the accumulation of useful knowledge, and this is where we run into conflict. So we have been looking at crowdsourcing projects, myself together with a PhD student at the LSE, whose name is Gregory Asmolov. Seems to me, and I don't need to remind this audience, so I will go very quickly through this, there's a wide variety of digital platforms for crowdsourcing, calling upon disparate communities to contribute information, which is available both to formal science and to the loosely connected communities. What I want to suggest to you is that depending on the bias towards one or other of the social technologies, constituted or adaptive authority, this implies different outcomes in terms of approach, in terms of the values, in terms of opportunities for information curation. And that, having gone through the literature, there is astonishingly little comparative empirical study of who actually initiates and invests in these kinds of activities which involve groups of loosely connected communities and potentially formal science, of who controls and assesses the information, where lies the power, who is allowed to access, and who applies crowdsourced digital information, regardless of whether it's ephemeral or whether it is actually curated. And it seems to me that this is a huge open area for many PhD students, dare I say it, but for all of us to invest in comparative research. And so we did look at a sample of instances of crowdsourcing, which the question we asked is, where is the primary location of these instances? I don't have time today. Organizers will have heart failure if I start going through every one of these. But I want to just highlight one or two just to make the point. And if we think about why the LHC Home initiative is located under curated information and constituted authority, we can think about it because it's a CERN initiative. This is the one where it uses the spare capacity of citizens' computers to process the Hadron Collider data. So it's interested in curated stocks of information. If we look at Zooniverse, this is a hub for citizen projects. It's initiated by formal science, but the hub can contain projects which disappear overnight, a bit like open source projects. Some of them fly, some of them don't fly. So it's really engaged principally in ephemeral information. Under the adaptive curated side, it's an interesting example which is called Radiation Map, which comes from Russia. This was a loosely organized community initiative which was started after the earthquake in Japan. The reason it's under curated is because they've made enormous efforts to use scientific methods to validate the information and fed their information back to the media, who have corrected the Russian government's statements. But there were no radiation problems, not from Japan, but within their own country. And on the last quadrant, Astronomers Without Borders is one that many of you will probably be familiar with. This one I've put in the ephemeral adaptive section because it is voluntary activity. However, it does have a council, and at least in its public domain, not behind the password protected site, but in the public domain, the information appears to be fairly ephemeral. So we have different combinations. The message from the empirical study, the details of which I'm going to skip, are these. In formal science, but not just formal science, government and other public organizations, there's a tendency to favor hierarchical practices and control. There's a tendency to validate information in line with a science model and to concentrate on the curation of digital information. On the other side, In loosely organized communities, we have bottom-up initiatives, dispersed control, often organized and aimed at the immediacy of application of ephemeral information flows, possibly in disaster situations. There's limited interest in curation, according to in the science sense. There are few financial resources and different norms for validating information. Okay, so far probably you're going to be nodding your heads. You can go along with this. My question is, what happens when you try to put all those quadrants together? What kinds of developments occur? You might have noticed in the matrix that I put something called global pulse in all 4 quadrants. Let me just deal briefly with global pulse. Global pulse is a UN head office initiative that started a couple of years ago, which explicitly says that it wants to use crowdsourcing and other online platforms in order to develop a stronger coordinated response for humanitarian assistance and emergency relief and disasters. It uses the lingo of big data, and it sees itself as making real progress in both developing ephemeral information in response to emergencies and developing scientifically validated information. It uses crowdsourcing for data applications, and it's trying to use scientific databases and bring them together. It's trying to combine constituted authority and adaptive authority, by which I mean there are all sorts of organizations involved in it, which are coming from formal science or various government ministries, and there are all sorts of organizations involved in it, which are coming from loosely connected organizations and groups all over the world who are generating information, often geodata and mapping and these kinds of activities. It combines an interest in curated information, as I said, and ephemeral information flows. And what is happening? It is confronting all sorts of conflicts that I mentioned before, not the least the privacy of the information and data which is being collected, which is coming from the loosely organized groups, the ethics of asking people to go into, this happens to be in Kibera, a slum district, going in and asking people to report on sanitation conditions and all sorts of problem issues. Issues of data access. How many of you can think of a government ministry that will freely give of its data? And again, thinking historically, we know from remote sensing data studies going back to the 1980s that ministries will not share their data for remote sensing across boundaries of other ministries. Now we talk about the virtual era. We know that many governments who are collecting big validated data sets will not share their data. So there are problems to be overcome. We know there are issues of rivalry and competition between big ministries of government. Often, it turns out, also between different loosely organized groups. Dare I say it, there is competition in the commons quite often between different groups. Reputational issues is who gets to be first to address both immediate problems of an humanitarian type. NGOs are notorious for worrying about their reputational assets. And also governments do not want to be seen as falling behind in terms of solving problems. So, just to sum up, formal science professionals and loosely connected online groups make strong claims about the usefulness of their digital information for social action and problem solving. Increasingly strong claims. Clay Shirky's radicals think that their solution of open communities is the way forward. Joke Bunkler often only deals with peer-to-peer commons-based production. He doesn't worry about the other forms of organizing information. Differences in social technologies create barriers to realizing the benefits from the contributions of these groups, and this is why this matters. There are benefits to be had. Hastily formed networks often clash with the science model, producing incoherent accumulations of largely unmoderated information. Now, this is a problem. What do we do about the problem? Well, one option is that constituted authority prevails. Those producing the ephemeral information, if they want to ensure that their information becomes socially useful and applicable, not just in the immediate problem time, but later, have to shift to adapt the norms and social technologies of conventional constituted authority. In this way of thinking, incentives get created for digital information production and for curation following the open science model. Arguably, we might win. But in doing so, those loosely connected communities are going to have a lot of their values compromised. Research attention about this shift into the top quadrant where the X is, focuses on the struggle over widening the scope for public domain knowledge in the proprietary sphere. This is the pushback that Paul was talking about. There's another option, and that is, which some of the radicals, and some of those the scientists don't really like to talk to very often, is that adaptive authority prevails. Ephemeral information flows retain their adaptive authority, modes of collective action, with little attention to curation. A great loss of information to society. Incentives are created for digital information production and curation following the bottom-up participatory online culture model, but it's somehow detached from the formal science model. Research attention focuses on the characteristics of horizontal governance on online distributed groups, but ignoring the interactions with formal institutions, or largely ignoring. I'm overstating the problem here to make the point. These are different communities. If you do literature searches, you can find lots and lots and lots and lots of studies of open science, formal science professionals, and how they're adapting to the big data era and to crowdsourcing. And you can find lots and lots and lots of studies at the other end of the spectrum of online distributed groups. And they are painted quite often in the literature as the traditionalists and the radicals. Big emphasis on radical. They will destabilize science, they will undermine conventions, etc. And then there's possibility of a third option, which is not one that I can give you the answers to, but one that is particularly intriguing, which is new combinations, where research attention, and this is my point, will focus on the struggles to build bridges between the social technologies of constituted and adaptive authority within the information commons, not just focusing on strong collective action modes, but other emerging modes, where constituted authority becomes better attuned, I am an optimist, to the dynamics of producing large ephemeral flows of information, meeting the immediacy of real-time challenges, and engaging with the politics of adaptive authority, the emergent norms of self-organizing communities. How do they do this? Well, as in the Global Pulse case, they do it through negotiated contracting and through collaborative agreements, which are halting, difficult, but need to be studied in order to understand how and in what context do they work. Are there cultural barriers that are insurmountable? Are there ways around, workarounds? And also it has to be remembered that the loosely organized community or groups will successfully resist the seizure of control by constituted authority as a result of these negotiations. In other words, they somehow manage to stabilize their relationships more or less in the center of this matrix without the implication that become one blurred gray pot of a singular form of governance arrangements for the open commons, that they maintain their diversity, that they maintain diversity in the interests of improving social welfare and social problem solving. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor, for your presentation. Also, thank you for keeping the time. We are already over our time for questions and answers, but we will nevertheless take just a few. Please try to be very brief. Yes, please.